The goal of this paper is to make one basic argument about the nature of Soviet socialism as a system of production from the standpoint of critical Marxist analysis. To make my rather abstract theoretical argument clear, I'll explain it through the short clip which opened my presentation from Dziga Vertov's iconic 1929 film Человек с киноаппаратом, or Man with a Movie Camera. Yet, before I dive into this clip, let me state the central claims of my paper from the outset for the sake of clarity. Western bourgeois analyses of Soviet socialism, as well as traditional Marxist and Soviet analyses, have generally defined the basic terms of capitalism and socialism in relation to two key institutions. First, private property, and second, the market. Simply stated, in this understanding, capitalism is understood as a system of production of goods through private industry that circulate through market institutions. Socialism, as defined by someone like Stephen Kotkin in Magnetic Mountain, is understood simply as the antithesis of capitalism, meaning a system that replaces private property in production and the market with statist ownership of production and statist networks of distribution. Such definitions, I am arguing, fail to grasp adequately either the core social relations of capital as analyzed in Volume 1 of Capital by Marx, or the core social relations of production within the Soviet system itself. For the mature Marx, capital could not simply be reduced to questions of ownership, i.e. private property, or means of distribution, that is, the market. Rather, at its absolute core, capitalism entailed a system of production that created historically specific forms of goods, commodities, produced through a historically specific form of labor, waged labor, or labor that is itself a commodity to be bought and sold. Drawing on Marx, Georg Lukács, Isaac Rubin, and later critical Marxists like Herbert Marcuse and Moïse Pastone, I am arguing here that the domination inherent in this form of production manifested in the twin phenomenon of alienation and reification did not simply result from the cruel exploitation by private capitalist owners of industry, but were rather intrinsic to all production predicated upon wage labor. Placing the commodity as well as the specific form of labor congealed within it at the center of an analysis of Soviet society allows us to better grasp the nature of that society as a whole. Such an analysis reveals Soviet socialism to be not the antithesis of capitalist society or a vague alternative modernity, but rather a peculiar but unmistakable form of society predicated throughout its existence on what Marx understood as the primary social elements of capital, alienated labor, and the commodity form it engendered. The production of Soviet commodities stands at the center of the clip from Man with the Movie Camera, which opened my talk. Among the most revealing snippets in all of Soviet film, the scene purports to show us the social relations of Soviet society at the outset of the Stalin Revolution, that is, at the dawn of fully realized socialism. At first glance, the clip appears to be an example of the familiar industrial fetish scenes ubiquitous within Stalin-era film. Yet deeper analysis reveals a visual representation of what became and would endure as the defining understanding of the nature of socialism and socialist production in the Soviet Union. The montage comprises 42 cuts of film, spliced to juxtapose scenes of women workers in two key sites of early Soviet industrial production, the textile mill and the cigarette factory. The shots are punctuated with seemingly random scenes of economic and social life, taken not from the realm of production, but rather from those of circulation and communication. However, when we slow down the frames, we realize there's nothing random about the montage. The scene begins on the textile floor, where two women work the spindles together. They're mediated by the machine that oversees their production, but does not appear to dampen their cheerful mood and banter. Suddenly, the switchman appears, as he does throughout the film, to signal movement from one sector of social life to another, here to the shopkeeper's realm of circulation and rational calculation, signified by the abacus. From the abacus, Vertov cuts to the item being sold, the mundane pack of parole cigarettes, first shown as an abstract commodity, seemingly emanating sui generis from the machine. Vertov cuts back to the shop to show the exchange of money, then again to the seemingly self-animated goods, the newspapers and cigarettes. Vertov then takes us directly through the commodity into what Marx called the abode of production, the factory floor, where a young woman works with machine-like precision to make the cigarette commodity, folding rozkorochny cigarette boxes at an uncanny, ever-accelerating speed. While folding and throwing boxes with mechanical repetition, she banters with an off-scene coworker. The shop then cuts to the disembodied end result, the packaged cigarette commodity. Then back to the worker, laughing and smiling at her unseen coworker. The camera darts to a seemingly unrelated shot of telephone operating lines, constantly changing connections before showing the operators switching those connections. The scene cuts back to the tobacco factory, to the hands of another woman who effortlessly grabs the precise number of cigarettes from an endless stream every time and slides them into the packaging with the dexterity of a prestidigitator. The scene then cuts 22 times from the telephone operators to cigarette production, utilizing successively shorter cuts to convey the ever-increasing speed of production, a method of generating temporal dynamic through montage invented, perfected, and analyzed by Sergei Eisenstein. Now, following Siegfried Krakauer's dictum that nothing in silent film can be taken as accidental, Vertov's montage deliberately conjures not a scene of production as such, but rather production of the specific, historically determinate form of good that emerged only with the advent of capitalist social relations, namely the commodity. Here, I would argue, in a minute and a half, Vertov offers a visual representation of the opening chapters of Volume 1 of Marx's Capital, as he unfolds the relations of social life through the commodity itself. We first see the object, the cigarette pack, which appears as a quasi-natural thing in circulation, a good that can be sold for that particularly strange commodity, money, because both seem to possess exchange value. Yet for Marx, this form of value is merely apparent. What makes commodities commensurable and exchangeable is not an inherent exchange value, but rather the presence of an immaterial, non-physical substance, which he calls congealed labor time, or human labor in the abstract. This congealed labor time is, Marx argues, the quote, substance of value. Now, rather than being simply another name for price, value is measured as a quantity of labor time. Value, however, is not created through any form of labor. It's not simply physical expenditure. Rather, for Marx, value is created only through the particular, historically specific form of labor unique to capital, labor that is bought and sold as a commodity, which the worker alienates from herself and embeds in the commodity through the process of production. In short, wage labor or alienated labor. With brilliant skill, Vertov shows the process of producing the cigarette commodity no longer hidden in the abode of production, but openly celebrated in socialist film. What is explicitly absent, however, and indeed masked, is the alienation of labor itself. Conceived as a paean to a day in the life of the Soviet Union, Man with a Movie Camera takes us through all events from the mundane to the monumental, from daily waking, dressing, and above all, working, to marriage and divorce, birth, death, and mourning. But at no point does Vertov show us the emerging social core of everyday society, the worker receiving her wage. Yet we know that the two industries represented on the screen, the textile and cigarette making industries, were among the earliest to adopt production based upon wage labor in the Tsarist era. In Grodno, to cite but one example, the single largest modern pre-revolutionary factory was the Shereshevsky cigarette factory, which employed some 1,400 wage laborers, almost exclusively Jewish women. It was not only the second largest tobacco factory in the entire Russian Empire, but one of the most restive in terms of labor radicalism, a result of the dislocation generated by this novel form of labor. In the Soviet context, both industries continued to employ wage labor and reintroduced the most egregious form, piecework, in the mid-1920s to intensify production. In short, there was and is nothing natural or transhistorical about the wage labor form. Rather, it constituted a historically determinate form of production that first emerged in pockets of the Russian Empire in the 19th century, but was only fully realized, recreated, and massively expanded by the worker state. While the film clip foregrounds the wage labor form, it consciously denies the alienated nature of that labor. The smiling, talkative, eye contact making faces illustrate the claim that, unlike their capitalist brethren, Soviet workers are not, in fact, alienated, fragmented cogs in the machine of capital, or as Marx put it, quote, he is at home when he is not working, and when he is working, he is not at home. Rather, the film's laborers are at home when at work among comrades, enraptured in joy and indeed ecstasy, as the rhythmic production accelerates to orgasmic heights. For Marx, the very fact of wage labor, of being forced to alienate one's labor power in exchange for subsistence, rendered the process of labor itself self-deforming to the laborer, estranged from the objects produced, their fellow humans, and their own essence as creators. Vertov's denial of alienation is further underscored by the juxtaposition of happy co-workers and telephone operating cords. The message is explicit. While capitalist production generates alienation, socialist production engenders human connectivity, emanating from the shop floor and pulling together the totality of society through webs of communication. We have here, consequently, a ripe contradiction. Vertov shows us social relations of production that are precisely those of capital, predicated upon alienated labor, combined with a visual denial of the existence of alienation. The contradiction can only be solved if one accepts the definitions of capitalism and socialism outlined at the start of this paper. The nutshell version can be discerned in Lenin's October 1919 pamphlet, Economics and Politics in the Age of the Dictatorship of the Proletariat, in which he laid out his post-capitalist vision. The revolution, he argued, united labor communistically because, quote, private ownership of the means of production had been abolished, end quote. The state, he continued, had begun to organize production in state-owned factories and to introduce, quote, state-organized distribution of production in place of private trade, end quote. In short, Lenin defined socialism as the negation of capitalism, which he defined as, first, political rule of the bourgeois state, second, private property and production, and third, the market. What is absolutely critical here is that for Lenin, the question of abolishing capitalism and realizing socialism was understood explicitly and in toto as a question of the ownership of industry and the distribution of goods. Stated in overly simplistic terms, the fact of proletarian ownership and of the means of production through the worker state effectively rendered production and society socialist. The alienation endemic to capitalist production would cease once the socialist state took over and reconstituted bourgeois forms of production under proletarian rule. In other words, alienation was understood by Lenin to be extrinsic to the production process itself, not intrinsic to it. I am arguing that for Marx, alienated labor, which is the buying and selling of labor power, was the key, quote, social relation of production, of capital. Second, that alienation and its concomitant effects were intrinsic to this form of production. And third, that Soviet production in society was predicated from the very outset on the adoption and massive expansion of this form of labor. For Marx, overcoming capital necessitated the negation of alienated labor and the eradication of the proletariat. He wrote, quote, to be a productive labor is not a piece of luck, but a misfortune. For the Bolsheviks, however, socialism meant the full realization of proletarian labor across the totality of society. Now, to be fair, the fact that historians have generally taken as axiomatic Lenin's and later mainstream Bolshevik interpretations of Marx's concepts is justified in part by the emphasis Marx himself placed upon private property and the market in the Communist Manifesto. So, for example, to quote, in this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property, etc. Moreover, it might appear as anachronistic to suggest that Lenin or any of the early Bolsheviks should have viewed alienation as or as I'm arguing, the fundamental constitutive basis of capital. After all, the most fully developed treatment of alienation found in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 wasn't published until 1927, and then only in part by David Ryazanov of the Marx-Engels Institute in the journal Archiv, and not in full form until 1932. Yet, by the mid-1920s, the Hungarian Marxist Georg Lukács and the Soviet theorist Isaac Rubin had already separately teased out the central place of the commodity within Marx's understanding of the dynamic of capital. Rubin especially stressed that the commodity had to be viewed as a historically determinate type of good produced through the social relations of capital, that is, the creation and appropriation of abstract labor as congealed labor time or value. Both Lukács and Rubin discerned in these social relations forms of abstract domination inherent to the production process by focusing less on the concept of alienation, which did appear in Capital without the same emphasis as in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, and more on the related concept of reification. Reification, stated simply, refers to the phenomenon of capitalist life, in which the absolute centrality of the things of that system, namely the commodities, appear to exist as animated, socially interactive entities, while actual underlying human relations that produce those goods appear as stultified, masked, veiled, and ultimately hidden. As Marx put it in his analysis of the fetish form of the commodity, a, quote, definite social relation between men assumes the fantastic form of a relationship between things. Here, the social relation that comes to be veiled is that of the underlying buying and selling of labor, ossified and congealed in the commodity as value. As Lukács emphasized in his brilliant 1923 reappropriation of Marx's Capital, the process of production created a world of human-produced commodities that appeared as outside and alien to man, and appeared to construct their own social reality. For Lukács, Rubin, and Marx, the social ramifications were massive. They entailed the full subsumption of human beings into a form of production that appeared to dominate them from without, to regiment time, to regiment human movement and consciousness according to increasingly iron-like laws of rationality in production that came to dominate all aspects of human life, bursting the confines of production to subsume the social totality. Now, returning to the film, it might be suggested that even as Vertov visibly denied the presence of alienated laborers on the shop floor, the phenomenon of reification is utterly present in those cuts that appear to simply break up the scenes of cigarette production, those ceaselessly reconfigured telephone lines. Here, the cables move with rapid pace, switching connections, linking unseen populations. Yet, when the film cuts to the telephone operators themselves, they appear, unlike their cigarette-making productive sisters, as stone-faced operators completely enmeshed in networks of wires that ceaselessly control their movements. The objects appear animate and social. The humans appear as lifeless, trapped machines. Through this historical approach, we can begin to see the kernel of an analysis of abstract social domination that cannot simply be attributed to the ramifications of hypertrophied Enlightenment rationalism, Foucauldian surveillance, statist power, or the ever-beloved and completely amorphous concept of modernity that has come to dominate the field thanks to works by Stephen Kotkin, Michael David Fox, and others. While what I am suggesting here is that there is no modernity as such, but only capitalist modernity, defined as a system of commodity production predicated upon the wage labor form. This form did not persist into the era of Soviet socialism. Rather, it was mostly created and cultivated by Soviet power in the name of constructing socialism. To be fair, historians have widely grasped parts of this phenomenon. Richard Stites, for example, recognized the centrality of Taylorism and the cult of the machine to the Soviet project. Stephen Kotkin himself, in his essay on modern times and all of his work, recognizes the centrality of the machine. But these analyses remain at the surface level and do not consider the underlying social relations beneath the machine. Nor, it should be added, did the theoretical claims put forward by Lukács, Rubin, and others simply lose out to more conventional Marxist understandings that affirmed the construction of socialism through the mass appropriation of alienated labor. Rather, these claims were systematically suppressed by the party in the 1920s, in the case of Lukács, and in Rubin's case, repressed and annihilated through the terror. Suppressed along with these theorists was the attempt to develop a self-reflexive theory of abstract social domination emerging directly from the social relations of Soviet production. So in conclusion, let me suggest that the utility of reconsidering these theoretical positions becomes clear if we step back and view the arguments put forward here against the longue durée of Soviet history. Historians have rightfully emphasized the forms of brutal, direct domination inherent to the Soviet system, from mass terror to punitive legal practices to the inhumane carceral violence of coerced labor in the Gulag system. Yet in doing so, I am arguing, we have completely overlooked the single most significant social change of the entire Soviet period, the complete transformation of the Soviet lands into a world in which wage labor became the absolute everyday reality and necessity for all citizens. Rather than peaking in the 1930s, this social relation proliferated throughout the 20th century, ultimately subsuming even the realm of coerced labor when, in 1950, universal wage labor was extended to the Gulag system. This dynamic intensified post-Stalin with the freeing of millions from labor camps and the extension, first under Khrushchev in the 1960s, of the wage labor form to the collective farm system. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union became what would have appeared a distant fantasy in 1917, a society of nearly universal wage labor in which most citizens depended upon employment and wages for the purchase of commodities through markets, shops, and monetized networks of exchange. The end result was a society saturated with alienation, which necessarily manifested itself universally in the realm of culture. And we can see it in the dropout phenomenon of the 1970s, or in films like Sluzhebny Roman or Stalker or Moskva Slezom ne Veret, which all are saturated with deep alienation, yet ironically, in this case, alienation from labor itself. In these films, people are constantly at work, yet no one appears to be working. The reason, I would argue, is because of the fact that alienation had become universal socially. In short, rather than realizing Marxian visions of society emancipated from alienated labor, the Bolshevik project paradoxically created a society dominated by the universalization of alienated labor, the core relation of capital. Stated more provocatively, Soviet socialism ceased to exist not when it was overturned by capitalism, but when it finally succeeded in establishing the core social relations of capital on a universal level. Thank you.